Chapter 4 on intellectual disabilities takes us off in a new area and kind of a more intense area than a lot of the other ones because of the vastness of what's considered intellectual disabilities. Again, I'm going to try and be politically correct as much as I can and not using the term mental retardation, but sometimes you have to use that term to communicate what you're trying to communicate here. One of the things I would ask of you, do you know anybody that has intellectual deficiencies? We have a friend that we've been friends with for some time named TJ, who has mild disabilities, and he fits well in some of these categories about deficits in their social skills and stuff. And so we do know him, and then there's kind of a range from there. And maybe you think about that too as you go through this lecture. Who do you know, and what is your relationship with somebody that has mental retardation? Chapter 4, Intellectual Disabilities. In Chapter 4, in Intellectual Disabilities, before I go too far here, I want to put this here, and I know that's politically incorrect, but would you type that next to yours also? I won't say anything to anybody. But I just want that connection there, so put that little MR in your notes like that if you would. Let me show you where we're going to be. This is how we're going to cover it. First of all, definitions, which in this disability is huge on how you define it because of the vastness of this disability. And then identification assessments, characteristics of this disability, and then prevalence, how many, causes and prevention, and that's really kind of a flyover because that's an entire study itself. And then educational approaches comes a little closer to home, especially if you're a special ed teacher. Then educational placement alternatives for this. So let's go take a look at the textbook first on intellectual disabilities, and as I said, this is how this lays out. Let's flip ahead the focus questions, and they are on the PowerPoint also. What implications for special ed does viewing intellectual disabilities as an inherent trait within the individual or a state functioning? It reflects the fit between a person's capability, contrast in which a person is to function. It does a pretty good job here talking about this at the level of functioning ability. What should teachers know about IQ and the assessment of intellectual functioning? What is more important to determine a person's level of adaptive functioning, intellectual capacity, or supportive environment? And then how are the characteristics of students with intellectual disabilities relevant? What factors might account for the wide differences in these prevalences? Why was the prevention of intellectual proven so difficult? And it's just so many different things that cause that. Curriculum goals for students, most important features, and what is needed to make education of a student with disabilities appropriate in the general classroom. So you can imagine it's their behavior. So first of all, the definition. Let me come back here to the definition. It starts down here. Historical perspective. Let me just go up a little bit here so you can see this. First public school special ed classes were for children with intellectual disabilities. The first federal legislation support for special ed funds were for the people with mental retardation. So the first training, because so often then the mild disabilities that we recognize now didn't really exist. We didn't recognize them. We call them slow learners, but there was no special separation. But kids with mental retardation now intellectual disabilities, were not hidden, were quickly visible. And when we hear special education, often people think of Down syndrome, and that's today too. That it's often that would be people's perception of special education as someone with Down syndrome, and people have that notion that that's what they're like. But there's a lot of misconceptions about that. Now referred to as intellectual disabilities. And that, of course, creates some negative perceptions, is the is that term. Okay, so here's the definitions. Have been proposed, adopted, debated over the years, and changing. Early times, people this were called idiocy. I can remember that, or imbecile. I can remember my mom using that term for a neighbor boy that had some deals. They were feeble-minded. I'll give you some a look at that. How about this one? Simpleton. All terms that now we'd say are so derogatory and people would be offended at, and just say this in the news sometimes if you're a politician, one of these words, and see what happens to you, especially if you're on one side of the aisle instead of the other. This would be a big thing. So there was a lot of terminology for it, and so that's why there was a lot of hoopla about trying to narrow that down. And this was the group, the American Association of Mental Retardation, was the spokesgroup for this person, and still is. And so that was known as the AAMR. And now they've changed that to AAIDD, American Association of Individuals with Intellectual Disabilities Group. I don't know what the other stands for. Oh, Development Disabilities. American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. That's what their new acronym is right there. And they still drive most of the conversation about kids and adults with mental retardation. Look at the traditional, still mostly approach to defining this. Most recent is a state functioning reflects the person's capabilities in his environments. So this, remember what IDEA is? This is special ed. This is the federal legislation that came around in '90, but they have their own definition that's somewhat similar to AAIDD, or it used to be AAMR. So special ed, the feds have to adopt their own, or did adopt their own, and they published the same, and they too adopted the term intellectual disability now, defined as a significant sub-average general intelligence functioning, existing, occurring with deficits in adaptive behavior manifest during the developmental period that adversely affects the child's performance. Let me flip you over here so you can see that. Okay, and if it's not during the developmental period early on, it's not necessarily so. And we'll take a look at what is adaptive behavior, but significantly sub-average. And that's not new to you. That's nothing new there. The definition area is 3 criteria for a diagnosis of intellectual disability. First, a significant sub-average intellectual functioning. The word significant refers to greater than 2 standard deviations out. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, what those are, but approximately 70 IQ or less. And that would be 2 standard deviations. And it can be a lot less than that, but that would be what we call the most mild kids. And the second, individual must also have a significant difficulty with tasks of everyday living. And that's adaptive behavior. Significant. That's more subjective. That's more somebody's interpretation. That's a teacher or parent's interpretation. And third, the deficits in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior must occur during the developmental period to help distinguish intellectual disability from other disabilities. A child who exhibits substantial limitations of intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior will automatically meet the IDEA requirements. Then they talk about this, that this American Association of Individuals with Developmental Disabilities, with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Right, and there's a little bit different. Let's go back to that. Here's that significant sub-average functioning, significant difficulty with adaptive behavior, and deficits in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior must occur during that developmental period. Right. Then here's their definition. Intellectual disability is characterized by significant limitations in both the intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior, and expressed in conceptual, social, and adaptive skills. Originates before 18. An idea would say less, that has to be earlier than that. 5 assumptions, limitations in present functioning, must consider the context community. And that's their thing, isn't their IQ, but how do they function in the community? Invalid assessments consider cultural and linguistic diversity, as well as differences in communication, sensory. So there's a little bit different that way than IDEA. So the individual limitations often coexist with strengths. Purpose of describing limitations, develop a profile for needed supports, and that's what they're all about. Only using these to determine what supports they need. Appropriate personalized supports over a sustained period, the life functioning of the person with intellectual disability generally will improve. Let's go back to the text to talk about this. There's those following assumptions. I'm saying they're all about the supports that are needed. And this is how they see the supports here. Classification of it is by IQ, and it looks like this. And let me give you a little bit on how that plays in here on the spectrum. And when you get down in this area, very hard to get accurate readings. Up in here, a little bit easier to do that from the IQ test. So let's drill down a little bit more on what this means to you and me. This is just something I found. It talks about how the IQ looks like. If we typed this off, we all took it, theoretically this is what it would look like. That an average score is 100 here. 96% of all people fall within 30 points, meaning 2 standard deviations above or below. So from here to here, 96% of people fall in here, their scores. So there's about 2% below and 2% above. So where we concentrate a little bit is here's 1 standard deviation, which is about 15 points, and 68, or we say roughly 70%, are within 1 standard deviation, and this is normal. Then this here is low normal, and this is high normal. But we get down in here, even here at 85, we start to talk about a learning disability, and 115 over here we start to talk about gifted. But 70% will be considered normal intelligence. Right, let me just take you to the next one. This is another one I found breaks it a little better. Here again is at 100, and here is the standard deviations. And when we get out here, this is considered MR, or now ID, and this, of course, here is gifted. A lower average, and that. So you get down here, it's much harder to read, and same way up here. Again, much harder to assess and get accurate readings. Like Einstein is 160, and like Einstein, if you have your IQ in that range, you have you struggle as much functioning as somebody that has an IQ on the other end, because you're functioning at such a different level. But for the most part, in our general classrooms, it's here 70% are in that normal range. And here's kind of what IQ looks at. It's talked about a full scale, and there should be 2 separate scores when you talk about IQ from a psychologist, whoever administered, a verbal IQ and a performance. And here's the verbal thing. That's vocabulary, look at similarities of words, informations, and comprehension of things. And then there's an assessment for your working memory, like arithmetic, digital spans, letter number sequencing, how your memory works. Do you have that working memory? And often, of course, somebody with mental retardation, this is very low. And then the performance IQ is like picture completion, block designs, matrix reasoning, digital symbol coding, symbol searches, things like that. And often you'll see kids with learning disabilities that this will be much higher. The performance will be higher than verbal. Of course, that doesn't always play well in school. This is the political incorrect part that you don't want anybody to see. And I grabbed this off the internet, but it looked at if you typed the different nationalities, and of course the highest peak is the white, and I can't offer you anything, and African Americans suffer the lowest ones. And in our special ed, of course, that group, the African Americans, tend to have the most kids identified as having mental retardation. Hispanic here, and of course the highest average group is the Asians, and others in here. So that's politically incorrect to break them that way, but somebody found that to be important. This is about identifying and working with people simply on the supports they need, depending on not only their intellectual but their adaptive behavior, and then their participation, interactions, and social roles. Health is huge, and then the context. And so what kind of supports? Because when you see this, these two folks here, they will have dramatically different needs. Even though their intellectual functioning, if you come back to here, or even here, their intellectual functionings could be the same, but at one glance you know their supports as adults in the adult world and real world will be dramatically different. And that's why it's important that we look at supports needed as much as anything. So let me take you back to the textbook and talk about how they were used to be classified instead of like this. How we do it now, they use these two. And I remember when I first was involved 20-some years ago, these terms, the EMRs, they were called educable, mentally retarded, or they were trainable. There was only two categories. And then, of course, from there, they were not all children. Some were severe and profound that didn't get into those two categories. But if they felt they had a higher level, if they were more moderate, they were educable, or otherwise they were trainable. And then there was a group that wasn't trainable. And then this AAIDD talks about just what are the supports that are needed, and it's beyond the IQ because of how the supports they needed in the community. All right. Now here is your first inputs to your notes for this one. The first is you will define this for me, pejorative connotations. And let me show you where I want you to put that. Pejorative connotations right after this. You won't get these, but right after this, you give me the definitions here of the first thing here, pejorative connotations. And then your second thing is the recommendations of multidimensional classifications. An intellectual disability is described and classified to the following: identifying needed supports, such as identifying needed supports to describe. Here, I just want you to bring this in here. Intellectual disability is described and classified specific to the purpose of doing so, such as identifying the needing supports and enable the provision and funding of services. Describe the categorized learning characteristics to classify health, medical conditions. So I want you to bring this into your notes here. So you have that about the level of supports that are needed. All that goes right here. So that's 1 and 2 right here. 1 is pejorative connotations, and number 2 is those levels of support talked about there. Okay, here we go. Then we'll talk about, let's talk about identification and assessment. Assessing this intellectual functioning, and again, it's not real concrete. It's kind of subjective. Assessment of a child's intellectual function requires administration of an IQ test, and it's very heavily dependent on here in the mild kids. And this is done by a psychologist or other trained professional. For the most part, it will not be you, especially if you're the regular classroom teacher. But even as a special ed teacher, for the most part, administering the IQ test will not be you. The IQ test consists of a series of questions, vocabulary similarities, problems, solving like mazes, blocks, memory, and other tasks assumed to require certain degrees of intelligence to answer to solve correctly. The child's performance on these items is entered into a formula that yields a score representing their intelligence. So it's a formula based, and so you can't do it by simply administering the test and then looking at the score. And that's why I had you back here. this here look. That's the areas where you simply do some solving, and I've observed this, and it's a complicated process to do a thorough one. Now, I've done the free online ones, stuff like that isn't near as in depth, but it kind of gives you a general idea of your IQ. But to this degree, and all kids with learning disabilities almost exclusively will also take a IQ test. So you have a comparison, and learning disabilities, we'll talk about that next chapter, and that is where you compare their IQ to what their current levels of performance are. And that's how you determine a specific learning disability. Where here, we're really going to use this IQ more to look at their ability to learn. And I don't think the chapter does a very good job at all of giving you a peek of what this is. And throughout your schooling, nobody's talking about this. This might be as in-depth as you ever hear anything about IQ. So that's why I dug a little deeper here for you and gave you some of this politically incorrect stuff. All right, so in that, you have IQ tests. Let me go back to the text if you would. IQ tests are a standardized test. It has norm reference test, has a standard deviation, has a normal curve, a bell-shaped normal curve, and that's what this was back here, is a bell-shaped normal curve right there and right there. Okay. And here's the thing with IQ. Here's what we talk about. The cutoff 70 is intended. Higher than 75 or more may also be associated with this, according to a clinician's judgment that child exhibits deficits in adaptive behavior. And I dealt with that some where their IQ scores were 75 or above 70, but their adaptive behaviors indicated that their functioning was below that of someone that was mildly mentally retarded. But here's the thing, and this is what is hard to get away from. As much as we want to criticize IQ scores, it's still a very strong predictor of school achievement. And if you're scoring in the 70s on this, school is going to be very hard. And so you'll have a lot of skills. You can still have a lot of skills, but school is going to be hard. And this statement here is really important. Because IQ tests are composed largely of verbal and academic tasks, the same things the child must master in school, succeed in school, they correlate highly with school achievement. And we've done that to our culture a little bit, that people that do well with these seem to be get to go to the front, and it's based on this. So a lot of our really smart people that their expertise is not in this area, I think, go into business and become millionaires for a lot of times. But in academia, where you and I are sitting now, this skill is honored, and that is verbal and academic tasks. And so that's why there's two areas of verbal and the performance. And again, here's that distribution, just like we looked at before. You can see the lines. Okay, so here's what I want you to do here. This will be our number 3. I want you to tell me what this is. What is a hypothetical construct? Right here. What is a hypothetical construct? Put a definition in there if you would. Culturally biased. And this, each of these have a line, so I want you to bring a line in for each of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And each one has a little explanation here of those. Okay. And so you'll develop that a little bit for me. That's number 3. And then this adaptive behavior, assessing adaptive behavior. It's a collection, interesting, a collection of conceptual, social, and practical skills. Conceptual, social, and practical skills have been learned by people in order to function in their everyday lives. Very subjective. It's a very subjective skill. It's very subjective to analyze this. The systematic assessment of adaptive behavior is important for reasons beyond the diagnosis. Adaptive skills exhibited by a person with intellectual disabilities, as well as the nature and severity of maladaptive behaviors, are critical factors to determine supports. And that's what you're always after here, is what are they going to need to be successful? And where do they need to be successful? Not only school, but work, community, home environments. Oh, the thing we're not talking about here is we have a number of very normal functioning kids that have behavior disorders that have some problems with these same adaptive behaviors. Really was the onset of autism, the spectrum disorder, which we'll get to study in the future. But these are different adaptive scales that are mentioned here. The most common one I'm familiar with is the Vinland Adaptive Behavior Scales. And again, it's subjective, very subjective. It's a series of things. Here we have this: adaptive skills exhibited by a person with intellectual disabilities are critical factors in determining the supports that are needed. Measurement of adaptive behavior has proven difficult because relative nature of social adjustments and competence. Most instruments consist of a series of questions that a person familiar with individuals answers. And who is that person? Generally like a parent or somebody other than the immediate caregiver. Listen, I just listed those from the textbook. Let me take you back here. Thought I had a Vinland thing here. I'm going to give you this too. I found this in a little Google search. Somebody gave an IQ test to teachers, IQs of teachers, and the average they found, it was a small group. Let's see, it was in 1988. I think it was. But anyway, this was the average they found, 108.4, and then they broke it down a little farther. This can be a little painful. How many in each of the groups? But in the college university it was 114, 107 average IQ for the 150 high school teachers. The K-8 teachers, there were 369, 107. Special ed teachers, only 18 took it, but theirs was a little bit lower at 105. Then an other group. And I can tell you, mine is right in this ballpark. I'm about exactly one standard deviation above. I don't know if that makes you feel better or worse or what it does, but that's the adaptive thing, because the relative nature of social adjustments is going to have you do something with that. Let me see if I can. I thought I had a cognitive. I had the Vinland thing here. I think it was this here, a Vinland report. Oh, just a sample report of this. And here they interviewed a parent, clinical observation. Here's the different things they used to make the determination. And then they gave scores. Were able to assign standard scores. So, for example, in personal social, like relationships, play, and coping, they had a standard score of 72, which would be equivalent to somebody that was 9 years old. Okay, and how old is this person? Must have it up here. Is there I thought it was right here. 1 year, 2 months. That isn't quite. Oh, that's their chronological age. So they're delayed. An adaptive feeding and training and dressing. See, it's delayed, and then you have some narratives about it, and the domains they address and stuff. But that's kind of what the report looks like coming out of there for this Vinland. The characteristics of somebody with mental retardation. Again, you see this young man here on the right. You immediately have some images different than maybe it could be, because again, this child could be somewhat average intelligent function, but his appearance would cause you to think Intellectual disabilities is seldom a time-limited condition. So it's very seldom temporary, although some children with intellectual disabilities make tremendous advancements in adaptive skills. Most are affected throughout their lifespan. Many children with mild intellectual disabilities are not identified until they enter school, like the second or third grade, when more difficult academic work is required. So at that point, because here's the term I use, this is my term, they can fake it until then. They can fake it till it starts to get harder, and then you start to call for this. So you may find this mild intellectual disability at that point. Generally, there's some indication before that, but in IDEA, that might be the first time this is used. But children with moderate intellectual disability should show significance during the preschool years. It shows up. And then, of course, with more severe and profound disabilities at birth. So that's nothing profound about that. You know that. Okay, we're not quite ready for that. So there's cognitive functioning. So what about the cognitive functioning? Well, memory, difficult remembering information, and then learning rate, and then attention, slower to attend to relevant things, generalization and maintenance, trouble using new knowledge and skills and setting different things, and then motivation, an apparent lack of interest in learning. And so I want you to make another statement or two from each of these. This would be number 4 on your inputs. And it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things here. For example, on this one, the memory, it talks about how this affects them then. Ability to recall and use information occurs just a few seconds to a couple hours earlier, for example, remembering this. Can take longer than chronologically appears with the abilities to automatically recall information. So I want you to develop this more for each one of these, and this is a huge one, the learning rate and the memory type thing. So you develop each of these more than what they are in your notes. The characteristics of kids with intellectual disabilities. And then adaptive behaviors. Let me go to those. Here's the adaptive behaviors. By definition, children with intellectual disabilities have substantial deficits in adaptive behaviors. These limitations can take many forms and tend to occur across domains of functioning. Limitations of self-care skills, social relationships, as well as behavioral excesses. So what do those look like? Same deal here. Self-care, social development, and behavioral excesses. And they each have a line here, require extensive effort, must be taught basic self-care. And so let me go back here, and this I want you to contribute here, such as dressing, eating, and hygiene. I want you to talk more specifically about each of these. Direct instruction, environment, sports, add this. Routines and necessary. Most people with mild intellectual disabilities learn to take care of their basic needs, but they often benefit from training in self-management skills to achieve a higher level. All right. Jump by all this. And then social development. And this would be number 5. This 1, 2, 3 things here. Behavioral excesses. And it talks about it here too. Poor communication skills, inability to recognize an emotional state of others, unusual or inappropriate behaviors when interacting with others. That's the kind of stuff I want you to bring in here on this here. And then behavioral excesses are really kind of a challenge. In general, the more severe the intellectual impairment, the higher the incidence of severity of problem behaviors. And then down here, it's very interesting. Prader-Willi syndrome described in Table 4.2 are often engaged in self-injurious things like obsessive-compulsive behaviors like pica. And, pica. I'll put that on here and let you describe that also. Would you please, as part of this, tell what pica is? Okay. And this positive attributes of this is very interesting also. And that is, many display a tendency of curiosity and learning, get along well with others, and are positive influences on others. And that's a very cool part of this. Alright. Let's move on here. The prevalence. How many? How many of these kids? Well, this does a great job of talking about this. Here is the 2009-10 school year. 460,964, so not quite a 500,000 students aged 6 to 21 receive special ed under this category. So it's about 7.8 of all school-age children in special ed get their are considered intellectual disabled, or intellectual delays, MR. It's the fourth largest. Can you name here? I want you to name the top 3 categories. This is number 6 here. Input. And what are the top 3? This is the fourth. Tell me what the top 3 here, and number them like this: 1, 2, and 3. This is fourth. Prevalence vary from state to state, and that's really based on how they define this, how they define intellectual disabilities. Let's come back over here. Here it gives you some stuff by states, how they include those. And then cause and prevention. 3 areas they look at are prenatal, perinatal, and postnatal cause and effects here. More than 350 risk factors have been identified. Yikes. So how do we control for that? And it's 35% have some kind of a genetic cause, but another third have external things that do it, either trauma or toxin, and then etiology remains unclear about a third of them, meaning we have no idea. Etiology, no idea of a third. So a third they estimate is genetic, a third are trauma or toxin, and a third they have no idea what they are. And it could be these different ones. Let me go back over here. Here's some biomedical causes like Down syndrome, Fragile X come into there. Again, I want to go here. Perinatal before, perinatal during, or postnatal after the birth. Each ecological factor can be classified further as a biomedical, environmental case. So here's biomedical, like this. Here's the prenatal, perinatal, postnatal causes. And here's a graph, a chart form that's very interesting. Like prenatal things, chromosomal disorders, social things, behavioral things, educational things. And that's kind of a lot to chew on. And can you imagine that feeling if you, as a parent, had something to do with it? And it causes a lot of guilt, especially the third where they have no idea. It really can cause parents to have some real heartache and stuff. So let me go back here. I want you to bring these in too. Now I think this is number 7 here, and I just want one line for each of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. One line about each of those 10 things about the causes. And then we get into environmental causes, and now we get into some things a little tougher as far as this. Rubella was one. Well, it was used in the first 3 months of pregnancy, caused about 10 to 40% of unborn children to have problems. Congenital disabilities are eliminated if women are vaccinated for rubella before becoming pregnant. And so here they takes you through a bunch of these prenatal conditions. And this one here, obviously, you know the fetal alcohol syndrome one, Fragile X syndrome, PKU, Prader-Willi. In my opinion, not fun things to deal with. Let me go back here. I'm going to ask you to do this for number 8, is bring one line in about poverty and malnutrition, one about minimal opportunity to develop early language, child abuse and neglect, chronic social and sensory deprivation, lack of access to prenatal or child care, perinatal drug use or smoking, perinatal drug use, perinatal immaturity, cognitive disability, and then perinatal lack of preparation for parenting. And so you have this too. This is number 8, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 things here to bring in, just a one-liner describing each of those and their effect from the textbook. And here's those ecological factors. And it's really hard when you see some of these like parent drug use and things like that. And prevention, the biggest single preventative strike against it was the development of rubella in '62. Toxic exposure to material, substance abuse, environmental pollutants are 2 major causes, combated with education and training. But the thing that's so hard about this is these are addictions. Is substance abuse, and environmental things often are invisible. Back up here. Yeah. This will be number 10. Is one thing about each of these different assessments. Doctors identify certain genetic influences, use the following screening and diagnosis. I know that amniocentesis is a screen for Down syndrome, and of course you're over a certain age, that becomes a play. And so we were much older. I was almost 40 when we had Alex, and Christy was approaching 40, so we were candidates for that. And we just we didn't really even consider it, because that's a recommendation from your doctor, from the gynecologist, that we do that. But what would we do with that information? We weren't going to deal with that information if we found out that he was. I mean, we didn't even look at what gender. We didn't know he's a little boy till he was born on either one of them. But on this here, if we found out that there was some problem, we had to deal with that then, and we weren't going to deal with that twice. So we just said, if you honor the sanctity of life and all, if God sent us somebody with Down syndrome, we would love to put our arms around him like anybody else, like we do as he is. So that wasn't for us, but I know a lot of people do that. And now you see a lot of people using this to stop pregnancies if there's any indication something's wrong. And unfortunately now with some of the ultrasounds and stuff we do, that we're starting to do gender selection and stuff like that. Based on this, but give me one about each of these things here also. That'd be your 10th input here. Then these educational approaches, like curriculum goals and stuff, academic curriculum. This is historical events of this, but I'm just going to flip by this also. Crystal limestone, functional curriculum. Self-determination, instructional methods, like a task analysis. And this is a very good thing about a task analysis. And I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it's where you take a task that they need to do, and you break it into individual steps like this, and then you check it each day of when they can do it. And so this is the one for morning arrival routine. When they get off the bus, they open and walk through the door, and it seems rudimentary, but somebody that's functioning at a very, very young age, even though they're older, it's a huge thing that they can do this. But how you track it each day and teach it each day, prompts and those types of things. So it's very good for that. Active student responses. So I'm going to have you do that. Same here. This is the academic curriculum that you would do for a while. Then a functional, students' independence. This is what they're after here. Self-direction, enjoyment, school, home, community, school. Then self-determination, and they're real big on this. Content to help a student set goals, plan and implement course of action, evaluate their performance, and adjustments in this. And it's really hard to teach that to kids. What I'm going to ask you to do here, and this will be number 11, is I'm going to tell you what for. This tells you what each of these are, but I'm going to ask you what you use them for. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 things here, and each one tells you what it is, but what would you use it for? What would be a common thing that you would use this particular skill for, this instructional method for? A task analysis, active student response, systematic feedback provided by the teacher, transfer of stimulus control, generalization of maintenance, direct frequent measurement performance. Why are these important? What do they have to do with this instruction of these skills? Then placement alternatives. This you know too, that, and this is a little bit delayed here, but in 08 school, 17% were educated in the general ed as all. Do you remember we talked about learning disabilities? It's much, much higher. 27% in the resource room, 48% in a separated or self-contained, and then 7% are educated in separate schools, residential facilities, or home hospital environments. So a low percentage compared to the mild disabilities are in the regular classroom. The biggest group are just in a separate classroom. We call them self-contained, meaning their peers become just those kids in there. So they're in the general classroom to the tune of 17%. Okay. General classroom does not mean they're acceptably, socially, and receive most appropriate need there. Many special ed general classrooms are developing programs and methods for teaching students along with side classmates without disabilities. Okay. And this is the end of that, but this is interesting. This acceptance, normalization, principle of normalization was provided exceptional foundations. So interesting about how to set up this so that they're accepted. Important things that special educators do to help students identify their goals, provide this, will be to pursue their goals. Self-determination. All right. Chapter 4, Intellectual Disabilities.